Welcome this evening. My name is Mark Weber, president of Cleveland Peace Action, and I'd like to welcome you to our sort of peace forum this evening. And our speaker is Professor Walter Hixson, a distinguished historian and Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Akron. We were speaking just a moment ago about settler colonialism. Professor Hixson is no stranger to that theme and tool of analysis. In 2013, he wrote a book entitled, I believe, American Settler Colonialism. I should remember it. I enjoyed the book very much and recommend it. This evening, however, we are here to talk about what has come to be called the Israel Lobby. And Professor Hixson has written two books, at least two that I know of, maybe more. And that would be Israel's Armor, published a few years ago. And then more recently, perhaps within the last year or two, Architects of Repression. Both books deal with the Israel lobby and its effects on American policy and American politics. Professor Hixson is also a regular contributor to the Washington Report, and I enjoy reading his articles there. I suspect you didn't come this evening to hear me talk, so without further ado, let me simply introduce Walter Hixson, who will be speaking on the Israel lobby. Professor Hixson, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mark, Francis, and everyone else at Cleveland Peace Action. And I have a lot of respect for people who spend their time with local activism, and I'm more at my desk than really out as an activist. But I really admire and appreciate the work you all do, and people do all over the country in the face of powerful opposition. So yeah, I've written two books on the lobby, Architects of Repression, the most recent one. Let me just tell you a little bit about how I got there and what I argue in the books, and then we'll obviously take any questions or comments you folks have. I knew very little about the so-called Middle East conflict, really just had a basic understanding of it, even though I'd been studying and specializing and publishing and writing about American foreign policy since my graduate studies in the 1980s. It wasn't until this century and really the last decade that I homed in on the so-called Palestine conflict and educated myself on it. I've been immersed in it, including a eye-opening trip, which I'm sure many of you have had, to Israel, Palestine. In 2013, I spent 3 weeks touring and met Mazem Kimsa, by the way, and many other people there. So I've really been focused heavily on this issue for about a decade now, after a long career as primarily a Cold War historian. I had a lot of the simplistic stereotypes about this ancient enmities, conflict, religious fanaticism on both sides, endless struggle, etc. None of that is really the case. It's not a particularly complicated conflict. It is, in fact, a conflict that flows from the settler colonial identity of Israel, aided and abetted by the settler colonial identity of the United States. So I'll talk more about that. But we'll home in on the role of the lobby. So I wrote the first book, Israel's Armor, which was actually a term used by one of the founding members of the lobby. He said that the lobby or domestic support in the United States for Israel was the armor Israel cannot live without. And that book was a very traditional academic study rooted in documentary evidence from Jewish archives, lobby papers available in New York and a little bit in Cincinnati, and from the Foreign Relations series of the United States, and culminated really with the '67 war and the aftermath of the war, which of course spawned the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai for a time, and the Golan Heights. And it was a very revealing period, but I wanted to, I was by that time really captivated by this realm of study, and went on, and in Architects of Repression, the more recent book and the more affordable book, by the way, and a more comprehensive book, studies the entire history of the lobby. So if you want to get one, get the latest. Architects of Repression is, I think, my most important book on the whole history. So that carries it to the present. The origins of the lobby, its evolution in the post-World War II period, its rapid, massive growth in the 1980s, and its involvement in the global war on terror, and to the repression of free speech and equation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism today. So all of that is assessed in there. And there's also an appendix that reflects my study of ancient history and the history of Judaism and of anti-Semitism and the biblical narrative of Israel. That's an appendix to the book Architects of Repression. So it's all in there, and I think it's a pretty definitive study of the lobby. And so I obviously won't be able to talk about everything that's in the book, so I recommend it to you. So the lobby, let's do a foundation in settler colonialism. What settler states, the United States is one, Israel is one, Australia was a noteworthy settler colonial state. All the Anglophone states, New Zealand, were settler states. What does that mean? Settlers come to occupy a land because they believe they are more modern, more advanced, even providentially destined. You're all familiar with manifest destiny, idea that Americans use to justify the takeover of the continent and the invasion of Indian territories, as well as Hispanic settlements, and the claiming of the white man's continent in the 19th century. So they're heavily racist. Settler states are, by definition, they believe they are superior ethnically. They're chosen to take a land and inhabit it. And some of the seminal scholars, Patrick Wolf is probably the most well-known of settler colonialism, which is a fairly recent area of academic inquiry, last 15, 20 years or so, emphasize the fundamental goal of the settler state is elimination of the indigenous people, of the indigenous population. This doesn't necessarily mandate a genocide, but it does inevitably mean, as happened throughout the continent of North America, regular resort to massacre and indiscriminate warfare. So these are hallmarks of settler states. They can be genocidal, but they certainly engage in indiscriminate warfare and massacre. The idea is to eliminate the indigenous people and take the land for yourself as a superior chosen people. This is American history. It is also Israeli history. And that alone will go a long way toward helping anyone to understand the symmetry and the special relationship between the United States and Israel. Both are congenitally aggressive settler states. However, Israel's distinctive, of course, any settler state is distinctive in some ways, but there are two primary factors that distinguish Israel from other settler states. One is the horrific and very real and many centuries long campaigns and pogroms of anti-Semitism, of anti-Jewish prejudice and infliction of pain and suffering and all manner of assaults on Jewish people. That gave and gives a particular intensity to Israeli settler colonization. The second major distinction between Israel and other settler societies like the United States or Australia, which also had a continental-wide ethnic cleansing, just as the United States did. But what separates Israel, and the other factor that I really emphasize and I think is most original in my work, is the belatedness of Israeli settler colonialism. What do I mean by that? Well, the United States, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, many other settler states, most other settler states, Argentina, were products of the 19th and earlier centuries. In fact, you can find settler societies going back to ancient history. But Israel and Israeli settler colonialism emerged in coinciding with the creation of the UN, international efforts to promote Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognition of the rights of indigenous people. In other words, the belatedness made Israeli settler colonialism reactionary. It's one thing to advocate racial superiority and chosenness and justify mass killing and removal policies as the United States did in the 19th century, when racism was considered scientific, that some races were superior to others. But by the mid-20th century, particularly in the wake of the Nazi genocide, the worldwide recognition of universal rights of indigenous people, it created campaigns against racism, which had been so much a part of the aggression of the Nazis and the Japanese depicting themselves as a superior Asian people, et cetera, spawned the civil rights movement in the United States. So Israel's emergence and development coincided with a much more progressive international climate in terms of recognizing racism and the rights of indigenous people, and a new regime emphasizing human rights. Nobody really talked about human rights as such before World War II, but with the creation of the UN and these changes. So I think this is really important to understand. Israel is a congenitally aggressive settler state, but it is also a highly reactionary settler state. And this accounts for much of its understanding Israeli identity, the fact that it has been led very often for much of its history by, frankly, war criminals, Ariel Sharon, Menachem Begin, racists like Netanyahu, repeatedly reelected. It's a very reactionary state. The idea many Americans have that Israel is the sole democracy in the Middle East and is a progressive democratic state is a deeply flawed depiction of a fundamental Israeli core identity. Yes, it is a democracy for Jews and for the 20% Palestinian minority within Israel's recognized UN borders that are allowed to vote, but are menaced with all sorts of racist behavior and are second-class citizens at best. Then in the occupied territories, it's a straight-out apartheid regime. So it's not a democracy. It's a reactionary, congenitally aggressive settler colonial state. That's how I depict and see and read the history of Israel. So this belatedness, to get to the subject of the lobby, required a heavy investment in propaganda and disinformation in order to misrepresent this core identity I've described, and instead emphasize that Israel is a vulnerable democracy menaced and threatened by fanatical Arabs all around it who want to drive it into the sea and destroy the Jewish state. Not that there aren't those people, there certainly are, but this long-held depiction of Israel as just wanting to live and let live, as Lyndon Johnson once very misinformed and a very consequential president put it, is false. Israel, in fact, has been the aggressor in this conflict from the Nakba in 1948 to the ethnic cleansing that's going on in East Jerusalem today, this very day. And many, many borderland assaults, indiscriminate attacks, not only in the occupied territories and vicious assaults on Gaza, but into neighboring states, particularly Lebanon, but also Syria and others. So it's a very aggressive, reactionary, settler colonial state. So the role of the lobby, what happened is essentially that the US Department of State wanted to have a more balanced, and I deal with this in Israel's Armor in great depth, but also in the Architects of Repression book. The US State Department sought a more balanced US diplomacy in the Middle East. So there was great sympathy for Israel. The country with the highest population of Jews in the world was the United States of America for a long time. It took a generation or so before Israel outnumbered the United States in the number of Jews in the country. So the United States, where many Jews had immigrated in the 19th century, particularly until that immigration was cut off or greatly reduced, had the largest Jewish population in the world. The United States was also somewhat, its support for Israel came somewhat in atonement for lack of response to the Nazi genocide. Not that there was necessarily a whole lot that could have been done other than win the war and eliminate the Nazi regime, which it, of course, eventually did do with a lot of help from the Soviet Union, which is rarely mentioned, by the way. A lot more help than we gave to win the war in Europe. In fact, the reverse was true in the Pacific. So great sympathy for Israel, somewhat of atonement. And nonetheless, the State Department, not because it was anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, but because it, wanted the United States to freely access oil, which World War II had proved was vital to what we now call, and ever since World War II have called, national security, another trope that is bandied about and has all sorts of implications, but is rarely interrogated the way it should be. In any case, the State Department sought to pressure Israel to allow some Palestinian refugees to return after that 750,000 were driven out in the Nakba, to recognize Jerusalem as an international city, and to cooperate to bring peace to the region with after the partition of Palestine had precipitated this first major war. Actually, there had been a major conflict in the 1930s in which Palestinians were also repressed and defeated. So Israel resisted the US State Department and resisted American presidents. Name one, and Israel has resisted them. Even the most pro-Israel presidents like Truman, Johnson, maybe not Trump. Other than that, every president has been resisted by Israel. Trump was so pro-Israel, there wasn't much to resist. But every other president has tried at various times in various ways to rein in this congenitally aggressive settler state. So, for example, Jerusalem. There was a strong held desire for generations, decades, until the Trump administration, that Jerusalem would not be the capital of the Jewish state and unilaterally proclaimed as part of Israel. Of course, East Jerusalem was supposed to be the capital of an independent Palestinian state. And the Vatican, in the early period, had a strong interest in not having Jerusalem be Jewish dominated. It waned over time. So the point about the lobby is that what some Jews, namely who would later form a group called the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. This is a core lobby entity, the Conference of Americans of Major Jewish organizations, or of presidents of major American Jewish organizations. Precursors to AIPAC had various names, AZAC and some others. Cleveland's own Abba Hillel Silver was a tremendously towering figure in the early period of the formation of what became the Israel Lobby. But the key nuts and bolts operator was a little known figure named Isaiah Kennan, spelled K-E-N-E-N, whose papers I found at the Center for Jewish History in New York and were highly revealing about the early history of the lobby. They discovered that the Congress could be effectively lobbied to get money for the settlement of Jews in the Jewish Commonwealth that they had lobbied to create. I date the creation of the modern lobby to the 1942 Biltmore Conference at the Biltmore Hotel in New York. I think that's where the modern lobby was really born. Now, there was a Zionist lobby going back to the early years of the 20th century, and it had been active in Congress in World War I when the United States endorsed the Balfour Declaration. So I'm not saying everything began with World War II, but the modern lobby that we know of, which extorts masses of money from the United States. Extorts is a pretty strong word, I guess. They get it freely provided, but everyone in Congress knows what will happen to them if they don't support money for Israel, and that is they'll be targeted in the next election. And there's a long record of that, and a largely successful one of targeting and removing critics of Israel or people who don't want to fund Israel. Although they've suffered some defeats as well, particularly in recent years. But overall, as long as I'm introducing this subject, let it be said that the Congress of the United States is utterly in the grip of AIPAC. AIPAC controls the United States Congress. The United States Congress does what AIPAC says. It's really that simple. There are some exceptions. There are some anomalous events that are cited when they didn't get their way, but by and large, it has been a really tawdry record of a foreign nation dominating the Congress of the United States. And this was established in the 1940s and took off in the 1950s. Eisenhower famously fought off the lobby to some extent in the wake of Israel's attack on Egypt and occupation of the Sinai in the 1956 Suez War. That had been preceded by significant borderland aggression in Jordan, including the infamous Kibbutz massacre perpetrated by Sharon. His career as a violent ethnic cleanser and killer began there and continued into the next century. So Eisenhower got Israel to withdraw, but really it's too complicated to go into now, set the stages to some extent for the 67 war. In the interim, the Israel and the lobby also fought off American efforts. This is something else that is all too rarely discussed, to prevent Israel from getting the bomb. Israel lied and lied and lied to the United States, to American presidents, to American diplomats, and was intent on developing the bomb, which it did in the mid to late 60s, in preventing the United States from keeping the Middle East a nuclear-free zone, which it had sought to do under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act. The 1967 war has been badly presented in many studies. The record is very clear. Israel wanted the war, started the war, and occupied the territories after the war, refusing to negotiate land for peace. The subsequent peace process, quote unquote, is a farce, has always been a farce. Israel has used the cover of the peace process to enable the settlement, now totaling some 700,000 illegal migrants into the occupied territories. Peace process, two-state solution, big farce. major lobby chimera. That's what it is. There were a few points, Rabin, et cetera, where there looked like there might be some possibilities, but overall, largely, and with the lobby's heavy support, the peace process has been torpedoed and precluded from becoming a reality. So that is a big part of what the lobby has done. So the lobby, in close concert with the State of Israel, with the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, then with the formal creation of AIPAC in the late 50s, its very influential newsletter, the Near East Report, which I went through every, for this book, Architects of Repression, I went through every edition of the Near East Report, skillfully edited by Kennan, delivered to every member of Congress. This seemingly straight news depiction of Middle East politics was a lobby publication, just as Washington is full of think tanks like the Institute, like WINIP, the Institute for the Near East Politics, which is nothing but an Israeli lobby outpost. It's not a neutral think tank. It's a lobby think tank. There are several of these. The lobby is very expansive, has many proverbial tentacles, is very active in a number of levels. On the local level, Grant Smith of the IRMEP, of the Institute for Research Middle East Policy, is doing fantastic work on the extension of the lobby into state government. He's published a book on that, particularly in Virginia, to show how active the lobby is at the state level now. I think Mark had mentioned the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. If you want to keep up with this kind of thing, get the magazine, the Washington Report. And also those of you who can attend the meeting, which we are having in person this year in Washington, of the Israel Lobby Conference, which has been held for several years, usually in person, but last year virtually, which I've spoken at and many people have spoken at, and we'll be on this year in March, and we have some great speakers lined up, so check that out. So it's important to understand what the lobby is and what it does. In the beginning, it used letters, demonstrations, public demonstrations, but in the 21st century with the internet, it has been more virtual campaigning, and particularly in more recent years, legal actions, lawfare, assaults on free speech, equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, attacking students and student groups, attacking professors. But I mean, imagine, college administrators undermining their own students. This happens all the time because of the lobby. I just wrote an article for Future Washington Report on George Washington University, where this is just happening. It's indicative of the kind of things that are going on these days. They created a virtual space in the wake of the latest Israeli assault on Gaza. And if you haven't read works on I cover the assaults on Gaza in the book. If you don't have time to read Norman Finkelstein or someone else on real in-depth, I've read them, and they're covered in the book. Just vicious, murderous assaults. These are massacres. These are not wars. These are massacres. The casualty ratio is appalling. Yes, Hamas has lobbed pretty pathetic homemade bombs into Israel and has in return received a pummeling that your tax dollars have funded since 1948. Since that time, the United States has delivered $146 billion in military assistance to Israel. Listen to this if you don't know it, and I assume maybe many of you do, more than that given to any other country in the world. This itself is appalling and ridiculous, that this little country of 9 million people has received more military assistance from the United States and continues to receive it, as the vote on the Iron Dome just attested. The overwhelming vote of the US Congress on funding of the Iron Dome is just the latest in a series of lopsided votes in which there's no debate, no questioning. The United States just writes $3.8 billion annual welfare checks to the country that is also by far the most powerful military in the Middle East already, and faces no genuine threats to its security. Israel is not the least bit vulnerable. Israel's neighbors are vulnerable to Israel. So this is the situation we have and have had for a long time. What is aggravating, many things are aggravating, clearly, but among those that are highly aggravating are the fact that many people deny the significance and importance of the lobby. My book should put that to rest if the first book by Walton Mearsheimer didn't. And that book is now dated, but it was a solid book. Here these guys were, Chicago and Harvard scholars, and attacked like they'd never been attacked before for any other book they had written, and attacked by the lobby. But what's disconcerting is that others have joined in, even some prominent radical voices, and said, oh, the lobby's not the problem. The lobby's not that big a deal. They act as if it's a conspiracy theory. It's really absurd. No one questions the gun lobby. No one questions big pharma. AIPAC is right up there with those. It's not only the most powerful lobby in all of American history, representing a foreign nation. It's one of the most powerful lobbies in all of American history, period. So its role is to distort and disinform people about the Palestine conflict, to attack those who will criticize Israel, and to attack them viciously as Canary Mission, this deplorable online site that's been created by the lobby, to attack in the media. And the media has been craven. Mainstream media, led by the New York Times, is for the most part pathetic in its coverage. Academia is weak. I'm very disappointed in historians and scholars, including scholars of foreign relations. Many are, of course, if you don't have tenure, it's understandable because they'll attack you and try to destroy your career. And I'm retired at this point. I don't have to worry about it. But, as a young scholar, it would have been very dangerous for me to take up this study. So it's understudied, underemphasized, underreported, underchronicled, misunderstood, and people fall victim, including even some progressives who, call attention to vote for weapons for Saudi Arabia, the AWACS in the early 1980s, and say, see, the lobby doesn't win them all. They point to the Iran treaty. Well, we've seen what happened to the Iran treaty. So the lobby is very powerful, and it's very much crucial to maintaining this situation where Israel is routinely issued these checks. And by the way, they're doled out in a way no other country receives them, so that Israel, rather than the United States, can the early dispersal allows them to collect the interest on it. Any criticism of Israel is policed, and the lobby orchestrates all of this. They know that they're important. They know they're the armor Israel cannot live without. That's why they've doubled their number of employees, built a new and much larger building in Washington, D.C., and they keep files on every member of Congress. They introduce themselves to every member of Congress. They fund junkets, skirting laws meant to prevent this kind of thing for any member of Congress. They dominate and utterly control the United States Congress. This is the reality of what the Israel lobby does, and it's why injustice in Palestine remains. So there is no peace because Israel and the lobby have not wanted peace. The two-state solution is dead, and that is a real possible problem and vulnerable point for Israel and the lobby, because a one-state solution is a possibility, and that would be an actual democracy in Israel rather than an apartheid, congenitally aggressive settler state. We're not near that right now. When that'll happen, no one knows. It's the only solution that I see possible with all the settlement that has gone on in the occupied territories. And have a unified one-state solution, a real democracy with real voting rights and real equality. Of course, Israel has gone the opposite direction in 2018 under the palpably racist Netanyahu, who, by the way, if you want an illustration of the lobby domination of the US Congress, just go remind yourself and look up the video of that speech he gave in, I think it was 2018, in 2014, utterly in contempt of Obama and invited by the Republicans without the courtesy of even informing the administration, interrupted by copious standing ovations, treated like a godlike figure, this palpably racist, chauvinist, violent, reactionary Israeli leader, one in a series of them. What they have done in recent years, proclaimed Israel a Jewish state. So this means that it cannot be a democratic state. You can't be a Jewish state and a democratic state. You can't be you can't designate one ethnic group as superior to 20% of your population, let alone the apartheid character of the occupied territories and the brutal violence meted out against Gaza regularly, and call yourself the sole democracy of the Middle East. But they do that. And they get away with it because of the lobby, the power of the lobby. Americans, except for a few progressives, dole out the money. And so this system marches on. But you have the BDS movement, brutal reaction, fierce reaction against it with lawfare, attacks, again, equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, attacking students, professors. Fortunately, we have groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, Palestine Legal, and others that fight this on a regular basis. So it's an ongoing battle. I'll conclude here and get some questions and answers. I had just also reviewed for the magazine Richard Falk's memoir. And Richard Falk's a wonderful man, former raconteur of the UN, who devoted a long career and is still going at it in his 90s to this, among other causes. And Falk, is under no illusions that we're sort of winning and a solution is at hand. But he writes in his memoir of, the importance of continuing to fight and, if necessary, die trying. So that's what we're doing. You have to keep up the effort to publicize the fact that this is an unjust regime. There is no justice in Palestine. It's a major violator of human rights. It's not a democracy. At a very minimum, the United States should stop funding this reactionary settler state until it really seeks peace and democracy, and that's what we're striving for. Okay, with that, it might work better to get, I'm sure I've left a lot out and you all have many questions or comments, so feel free to have at it.
Yeah, I did have a question for you, Dr. Henson. This is regarding Jamal Bowman and the controversy that he took a trip to Palestine. And then we have, I think it's Tlaib, the congressman in Minnesota, and others who've kind of recluse themselves on a no vote regarding funding of Palestine. Is the pressure that great for those who have given hyperbole or stated some of the things you've said, but were unwilling at the point of time when it comes to putting down a vote? What is the issue with that? And what is the issue also with the African American Congress people who tend to be vote on this line item, but they feel that their pigmentation is gives them immunity?
Great stuff, Mark. So this was the vote on the Iron Dome very recently. This is the Israel interceptor that captures a large number of these rudimentary rockets fired over from Hamas. So the United States has funded and worked closely the national security states and military industrial complexes work closely in developing these. So in the vote, to clarify who did what, Rashida Tlaib, but the only Palestinian woman in the US Congress, is, she is totally and without fail votes pro-Palestinian. You might be thinking of AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, who, in part because she's from Brooklyn, she said most of her constituents, had mixed views on this. So she disappointed a lot of people in the pro-Palestine movement by voting present. She didn't vote for it, but she didn't vote against it like Tlaib did. Neither did Betty McCollum, a Minnesota congresswoman who's been great on championing Israeli imprisonment and torture of Palestinian children. Yeah, they do that. They imprison and torture children as well as adults. You mentioned Bowman. So this is an election that's interesting that Israel and the lobby lost. Bowman replaced Elliot Engel, a longtime pro-Israeli stalwart from New York. But as Mark just pointed out, Representative Bowman was seen on one of these junkets where now it was sponsored by J Street. J Street is the liberal Zionist group, which is pro-Israel, but it's against certain things like the settlements. But they have all sorts of contradictions, does J Street, and they're also can be considered part of the lobby. But Bowman, like a lot of congressmen, took the nice freebie $10,000 trip to Israel and was seen there posing with the Israeli president, who has a long history of war crimes. So I think that addresses most of your questions. Well, let me go on to just say one more thing. You raised the issue of
the other congressman in Minnesota, the Islamic woman.
Oh, well, Ilhan Omar. Yeah, Ilhan Omar.
And there's another one in the Massachusetts. All of them, they were called the Squad at one time. It seems to be there is a dissipating on the issue of Israel when we talk about progressives and the progressive caucus. What is your feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, Omar has held steady. Tlaib has held steady. Cori Bush is also, and she's an African-American congresswoman who's also very courageously pro-Palestinian and sticks with it. And so does Omar, who's just been unbelievably targeted and attacked. I mean, just vicious attacks that are beyond belief to this Muslim congresswoman from Minneapolis. It's just appalling what she's had to endure. And if she stays alive, it'll probably be a miracle. But this whole issue Mark is raising, I think, is at once frustrating and also hopeful about this situation. Because what the United States does, as I've tried to make clear here, and as you all probably already know, is supports a racist apartheid regime. Now, how can Black Lives Matter activists and progressive politicians who want to see racial equality in this country, addressing its long history of racial oppression, obviously going back to slavery and segregation and still today in police violence, they decry that. And people like the New Jersey senator, what's his name? Its name is escaping me. Senator from
Booker.
Yeah, Booker, African-American senator from New Jersey, a passionate advocate of Black Lives Matter and really a wonderful progressive in many ways. He's an absolute coward on Israel and the lobby. He's absolutely in the thrall of the lobby. He won't challenge it. So this is frustrating. There needs to be, I believe, more African-American activism and involvement, and great question.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to one of the questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Mark and Professor Dixon. One of the questions in the chat from Paul and Lori was, where did B'nai Brit come from?
B'nai Brits.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not really equipped to answer that very well. I'm not a scholar of Jewish history, although I have dug into the biblical narrative, as I mentioned in the appendix of my book. So I wouldn't want to comment on that. It's part of the lobby, certainly. I can't really tell you about its origins and evolution. They're a player in the lobby, but actually not one of the major ones. There are other groups that are more active. than B'nai B'rith, but I wouldn't want to pose as an expert on its history or so I really can't answer your question, I think, if that's what you're looking for.
Thank you. And the next one came from Farrell Brody. Did you have, you had a comment? Did you want to voice that, Farrell?
Thank you. You know, I'm just amazed at the incredible hypocrisy of the United States government this week, when Biden is having this big democracy get together, you know, and his big thing with human rights, absolutely hypocritical, because he has nothing to do with the situation, neither in Saudi Arabia, but we're talking about Israel as well. I mean, it's just awful, awful, the way the Zionists have controlled the United States government. Amen.
Thanks, Farrell. And Farrell's a advocate from Jewish Voice for Peace, Central Ohio.
Yeah, let me just comment. JVP, and this is something I didn't talk about, but Farrell's group is really important. They're the best, JVP, but there are a lot of Jewish dissidents. And so if anybody has the notion that it's no longer the case that being Jewish means being pro-Israeli, it was for generations sort of the duty Jews were taught to be pro-Israel, and that held for a generation or two. It's over. There's what's been called the crisis of Zionism now, and JVP is the best. They are fully aware of everything and highly critical. Other groups, though, like I mentioned, J Street, you know, are really part of the lobby, and yet they are highly critical of Israeli settlement policy. And they also have criticized various bills in Congress and the liberal wing. But there is the Jewish community, quote unquote, is very divided today. And that's actually one of the more hopeful, important things that's happening, is that many liberal Jews, and especially a radical group like JVP, are highly critical of Israel. And that didn't used to be the case. So that augurs well, I think, for the future. If I just a brief comment on the human rights point that was made, you can throw Egypt in there as well. The United States also supports a highly repressive regime in Israel and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So it's not just Israel where we support reactionary, anti-democratic regimes. It's actually throughout the world and has, unfortunately, a long pedigree in American history.
Thank you for that. I know Egypt and Jordan get another $3 billion worth of military aid, and that's actually to protect Israel, from what I understand. But that's not a question unless you want to comment real quickly.
Go ahead.
So the next one I saw in the chat was from Rebecca Brown. Rebecca, did you want to voice your question in person? Let me find
not particularly. I think, you know, to me, the lobby, this is like one big amorphous, you know, who are these people? That's what I want to know.
Well, that's a good question. And so, yeah, I've definitely not spelled it out in depth. I mean, the book does do that in great depth from its beginnings to the present. So if you really want to know, you need to get the book. But I mentioned the Conference of Presidents, AIPAC. There are Jewish federations all over the United States, in cities and towns all over the country. And also very important are Orthodox, primarily Orthodox right-wing Jews, and especially those who have millions and billions of dollars, like the late Sheldon Adelson, the casino mogul from Las Vegas, who generously funded Trump with tens of millions, but has been a donor to the lobby for a long, long time. So to some extent, the Jewish community, so-called, is divided between a minority of very rich Orthodox Jews who drive this lobby and fund it, and a much larger number of Israel or of liberal Jews who are more critical of Israel, willing to criticize Israel, although it's often hard for them to take ultimate steps and support voting against funding it, like J Street. But it's these Jewish federations, Orthodox Jews. Let's don't forget Christian Zionists. The United States is the heartland of Christian Zionism. So a lot of Protestant ministers and their flocks are knee-jerk pro-Israel for misreading or I should just say taking at face value the biblical narrative, which does not hold up under history, as I've discussed in the appendix to that book. So it's a multifaceted group. It's primarily, but not exclusively, Jewish. There are Protestant Christians very active and a very important part of the lobby. It's active, Rebecca, on the local level, on the state level, but especially in Washington with AIPAC. So if you really want to know, the essence of the lobby is AIPAC, and it spirals out from there. There are many, many other groups. There are groups that are focused on attacking critics of Israel. There are media watchdog groups. There are these think tanks I mentioned, like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So it's multifaceted. It's your proverbial octopus with many tentacles out there. And so it is hard to grasp the lobby.
Thank you. And what's interesting, AIPAC doesn't give directly to Congress people, I don't think, congressional representatives, but that's not the next question. You can comment on that if you like. The next question is, what are some leverage points that might help us turn the tide for Palestine? AKA, what do we show opposite Exodus? No, but Francis asked, what are some leverage points?
Well, I mentioned, BDS was profoundly concerning to Israel in the lobby, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And you see how they react even to a limited boycott, like Ben & Jerry's, for example, said it would no longer serve ice cream, in the occupied territories or sell it to the occupied territories. Many draw a line between the occupied territories and Israel itself, which, I think is problematic because it's an apartheid state as a whole. So I would endorse fully BDS, but that is a point. I think the one that was raised earlier about the palpable racism in conjunction with efforts in this country that Black Lives Matter represented is another, and that is to emphasize just the appalling and inappropriate U.S. funding of a racist state. This is a vulnerability. Economic boycotts can be a vulnerability. The third one I would suggest is that just the funding. Somehow Americans who are always concerned about their tax dollars, although of course that's primarily when they go to help poor people, do better in life, or well, I won't get off on that one. So to emphasize this $3.8 billion annually given to Israel, if the United States, if the public can rally around the waste of this money to a little country of 9 million people that doesn't need it, it's already military powerhouse of the region. I mean, you realize we give more money to Israel than all of Latin America since World War II. Our neighbors, we have this border problem that it has been suggested we solve by investment in infrastructure and so forth and education in Central America to keep migrants from wanting to leave, but we'd rather give it to Israel, which doesn't need it and uses it to kill innocent people. So those are some areas that there may be vulnerabilities, but it's an uphill climb, let's face it.
Dr. Hixson, I'll make it real short.
Hold on a second, Mark Weber is next.
Can I be next after him?
You'll be after him, sir. Thank you.
Walter, I just wanted to add a brief footnote to your comment about the Israel lobby, including Christian Zionists. For better or worse, I know several people who are involved in something called Christians United for Israel, CUFI.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the spokespersons for that group, and I'm having a senior moment and I can't remember his name, but when you hear him speak, and I guess this gets to the crux of that, he talks about the importance of Israel, not in terms of Jews, but in terms of Christians. And so that he's convinced that Jews do not hear God does not hear the prayer of Jews, and that Jews' only function is to be around for the second coming and then convert to Christianity. I guess the core of Christian Zionism, and therefore really part of the Israel lobby, is anti-Semitism.
Yes, it's a nice irony you point out, Mark, and that's my understanding as well. This is sort of like, Trump laughing behind his back at some of the, less informed white supporters, white nationalist supporters that back him. These are people he would make fun of. The Israelis probably look at many of these Kufi and other members and laugh off their, well, however you want to describe the religious views. So Israel doesn't care. As long as they support funding for Israel and have the same goals as the lobby, they don't care about their wacky theories about the second coming as far as they're concerned. They'll take their support anyway.
Yeah, which is how the left works differently. The left often disassociates with one another, but yet the Zionists and the right wing will overlook the little differences and work for their common goal, which is profit and whatever else, land. Mark Jefferson, please go ahead.
Walter, I indulge you to be very frank. Is the Palestinian Authority, because of their training by the Central Intelligence Agency and by the Joint Special Operations, and the fact that they have assassinated activists, would you consider them in the vein of a Renamo Unito force? And the you mentioned the Jewish Voices for Peace. What is your observation or assessment about the vicious and ad hominem attacks against Allison Weir and others, and those who vacillate, who may be Nazi within this Palestinian solidarity movement?
I'm not sure about the latter point. Let me address the. You raise a really good issue with the Palestinian Authority, which is very problematic, and so many advocates of justice, peace, and justice in Palestine, and many young people and many people actually of all ages, and this is what gave rise to Hamas in the first place, are utterly fed up with the Palestine Authority, which, as you suggest, has been riven with corruption and infiltrated and has a very weak leader. I think that Yasser Arafat was very problematic, but Abbas is a very weak leader. So the Palestine Authority has no real credence. And this is just another reason why the two-state solution is doomed, and why Hamas was created and broke from the Palestine Authority. Now, there's some effort to unite, and you all are going to have Mazim Kimsa on. He could be a much better, more educated commentator on inside Palestine politics.
But I guess my question, you're familiar as a scholar with UNITA, what happened in Mozambique, Renamo, then we have the Tigray issues within who are backed by the United States and overthrowing the government. Sure. I guess my bit in essence, what I'm saying, are they in fact distant cousins or cousins of the Zionists, the Palestinian Authority, and will they seek to attack Hamas or any other or carry out assassinations? And are they a proxy for the United States militarily in concert with the Israeli government?
I think you present too stark a picture of it. I think everything you said and has elements of truth in it, but I don't think that's the sum total simple story of the Palestine Authority. But there's elements of that in it. It has been infiltrated, is corrupt. Certainly the CIA and Mossad and all manner of intrigue on the part of the Israeli government seeks to manipulate and divide. A divide and conquer strategy has been going on for a long time. In fact, the Israeli government was instrumental in helping to create Hamas. to create divisions among Palestinians. So, Mark, I think there's a lot to what you say, but I don't think it's, purely and simply a creation of the national security regimes in Israel and the United States to destabilize the region. There's some of that goes on, and the corruption is palpable, and there have been clashes between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas.
About the assassination recently.
Yeah, there have been, of course, assassination. Nobody does more assassinating than Israel. Israel leads the world
PA,
in assassination.
I'm talking about the PA.
No, I know you are, but I just threw in that it's important to note that assassination used to be something that Americans renounced. Remember that in the 1970s when revelations came out about CIA assassination, but now we have joined Israel in we're second to them in drone assassinations, but they lead the world and have led the way.
Thank you very much. Professor Dover, I saw you put a comment in. Did you want to make a quick question before our end time? You're on mute. You're on mute, sir. Okay.
I think that the speaker notably sort of presented his point of view, but let me follow up on my question. So let me follow up with another question. Is it not the case that well over 100 nations in the world have recognized Palestine, and the United Nations views the Palestine Liberation Organization as the legitimate representative of the Palestine people? And so on what basis can us American citizens not essentially be insisting that our government recognize this international reality and work for a foreign policy which respects the Palestinian rights, including their demand for an international conference to address this issue? So that's my question. I mean, who are we as Americans? Isn't it almost chauvinist of us to disrespect? I remember when the Palestinian ambassador came here to Cleveland and had separate meetings with Jews, including myself, as well as Palestinians, as well as speaking at the City Club, and made it clear he doesn't support, they don't support. And one Israeli Palestinian I spoke with just today reinforced to me that they didn't support BDS in there. But let's stick to this question of UN recognition. Who are we to say that we shouldn't be recognizing that reality and basing our foreign policy upon some decent amount of respect for the growing number of people that are recognizing Palestine and want to find a diplomatic solution in case our solidarity movement doesn't work out so well, that we should demand peace?
Let me answer that kind of in a big picture way, for starters, at least.
Yeah, I'll be there in a second. We're just finishing up with something here.
There's I've written another book. Actually, I'll push my other book at the same time. It's called Imperialism and War: The History Americans Need to Own. And your question sort of brings to mind, this is a recent book I've done on the whole history of US foreign policy, imperialism and war. This country is not as progressive as people think it is. And this is a long and complicated issue that we don't really have time to go into here. But let me just give you the short version of it. Our discourse is very powerful. We're the land of the free, the home of the brave, the land of liberty, et cetera, et cetera. It's really not uniformly the case and hasn't been throughout American history. So the United States is simply not, Michael, as progressive a state as your question sort of implies that it should be. Who are we to not? I mean, we're supposed to be representing freedom, racial justice, equality. That's supposed to be what we represent. We really haven't uniformly done that throughout our history. So I won't back that up now because it's too big an issue, but I'll just throw that out in part. The second thing I want to say in response to your question is that if you look at the record of the UN, so the UN, of course, is headquartered in New York. It was created and funded by the United States. It has long been dominated by the United States. The United States has veto power, but it is stunning and striking if you look at many of these votes in the UN, particularly on settlements and the illegal occupation of Palestine that has gone on since the '67 war that Israel initiated. The votes in the UN are amazing, some of them. 126-4 with the United States, Israel, and throw in a couple of Marshall Islands. There have been several votes like that throughout the history of the conflict. Votes on recognizing Palestine, votes on ending the settlements. So the United States has been an architect of repression in the UN and has used its power over the UN to preclude the type of viable international settlement you're talking about.
Thank you all. That closes our Q&A for tonight. Mark Weber, would you like to close this out?
Well, I would like to simply say, first of all, to Professor Walter Hixson, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking and informative presentation. Thank you, Professor Hixson. And to all of you who attended, thank you. And for those of you who asked questions, some very good questions, thank you as well. We will have our next Peace Forum will be on January 18th. And our speaker will be Mazim Kumsa, who is a really civil rights and human rights activist, among many other things, in Israel, Palestine. Anything else we need to cover, Francis?
Yes, one thing, Mark. You will soon be getting, many of you will soon be getting a newsletter, our end of the year newsletter, and we urge you to support Cleveland Peace Action, be a member. We don't have a very large budget. We're an all-volunteer organization, but we could use a little support now and then. So think of us when you get the newsletter. You can donate online too.
Thank you all very much.